Brad grew up longing for a family and had lost the only one he had just months ago. Now he's returned to the town where he was born, to a house he barely remembers. But life had plans for Brad in this little town. This place was about to become his family. He just didn't know it yet. Christmas was quickly approaching. The entire town was blanketed in pure white snow, and as always the residents had adorned their homes and streets with twinkling decorations. Colored lights wrapped around snow-laden pine trees, and the massive Christmas tree in the center of the square made the town look like a scene straight out of a movie. As Brad strolled across the square with a steaming thermos in hand, he took a sip of his coffee, the warmth slowly spreading through him. For the first time he truly felt happy about living in this small, peaceful town. It had only been a few months since Brad had moved here, yet he already realized how much he had grown accustomed to it. He used to work in a big city, right in the heart of chaos and crowds. Straight out of college, he had jumped into an office job, immersing himself in a relentless work schedule that left no room to breathe. Looking back now, he realized he had forgotten what peace even felt like amidst that constant hustle. Everything had changed with one piece of bad news. Brad's only family, his elder and closest companion, his grandfather, had passed away. Though the old man's death was natural, it marked a turning point in Brad's life. His grandfather had raised him with love and care after Brad had tragically lost his parents in a terrible accident. The warmth, cheerful stories, and moments of affection from his childhood with his grandfather now washed over Brad like a wave of longing. On the day of the funeral, Brad spoke with his grandfather's lawyer and learned something that would change his life forever. His grandfather had left him an old mountain cabin in a distant town, one that Brad hadn't visited in years. This cabin was where Brad was born and lived until he was 5 years old. After his parents' accident, his grandfather had abandoned the house, unable to bear the weight of those painful memories, and never returned. Brad found it hard to confront this reality. At first he thought about selling the cabin. He couldn't imagine a future there, burdened by the shadows of the past. But when Brad visited the town to see the cabin, everything changed. Nestled in the middle of a snow-covered wilderness, the cabin looked like something out of a painting. Built by his family's own hands, the cabin stirred faint memories in Brad's mind, moments of taking his first steps, his mother's warm smile, his father's strong arms. In that enchanting landscape, Brad felt as though he had found a piece of his past. What he had intended to sell now became something he wanted to hold on to as part of his life. Leaving the chaos of the big city behind, Brad moved to this quiet town. After renovating the cabin to give it a modern touch, he pursued something he had always wanted to try: working at a car repair shop. He had been fascinated by mechanics since childhood but had never dared to follow that interest in the big city. He didn't need much money, his mental state wasn't suited to a high-pressure job anyway. In this small town, Brad was determined to rebuild his life and rediscover the peace he had been searching for. The townsfolk had warmly welcomed Brad. Everyone did their best to help him settle in, but Brad, burdened by his losses and emotional weight, didn't show much openness in return. He gave short, surface-level answers to questions and avoided long conversations. Even when receiving a simple greeting, he unintentionally kept a distant demeanor, making the townspeople perceive him as cold. The townsfolk had already learned about Brad's past. Many had made an effort to support him and help him feel at home. Some had tried to befriend him, but the walls Brad had unknowingly built around himself thwarted these attempts. Unaware of these barriers, Brad was trying to get used to his solitude. However, his boss at the repair shop, Paul, might have been the only person who truly understood Brad's situation. Paul was a quiet, unassuming mechanic who had lived in the town for years. He didn't talk much or ask unnecessary questions. In a way, he was like a lone wolf who understood Brad's silence. A natural rapport developed between the two. Paul believed Brad was talented and patiently taught him the trade. Brad, in turn, learned simple repair jobs and honed his skills by observing Paul work on more complex tasks. Their calm work routine was almost therapeutic for Brad. Even though he would spend New Year's Eve alone, he planned to prepare a nice meal for himself before the New Year's Eve. While shopping, Brad noticed an elderly woman dressed in bright colors and wearing a constant smile. She radiated happiness as she picked out fruits and vegetables. But suddenly her hands began to tremble and she dropped her bags. Without a second thought, Brad bent down and started picking up her scattered fruits and vegetables. The woman, slightly embarrassed, said, "Oh, my fault. Old age, you know. Sometimes your hands and feet just decide to take a break," and she let out a sweet chuckle to ease the moment. If you're enjoying this story and you're still watching, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to our channel. That way you won't miss any of our upcoming stories. As Brad handed her the bag, something caught his attention. The woman had only taken one of each item. Slightly hesitating, he asked, "Are you on a diet or something?" The woman let out a hearty laugh this time. "Oh, funny boy. And here I thought people said you were cold." She stopped mid-sentence, realizing what she had said, and pulled back shyly. Brad smiled faintly and asked, "What do you mean?" The woman replied, "Oh dear, it's nothing. It's just your adjustment period. People here are very close and warm to one another, so it's normal for them to find you a bit unusual. It's all temporary," she said, chuckling softly to smooth over her words. Brad wasn't sure how to respond to her comment, but his earlier question still lingered in his mind. To keep the conversation going, he asked, "So, why are you buying just one of everything?" The woman paused and then took a deep breath. "I'm spending this New Year's alone. My daughter was supposed to visit, but the roads are blocked with snow, and her work is keeping her busy. She won't be able to make it this year," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Brad felt a pang in his chest. He knew all too well what it meant to be without family, and that feeling stirred a sudden courage within him. "In that case," he said, "would this lovely lady care to join me for a special dinner before New Year's Eve?" The woman, surprised, asked, "Oh really?" Brad smiled and replied, "Yes. I'm planning to grill some food at my mountain cabin. I think you absolutely should come. Where do you live? I'll come pick you up that day." Touched, the elderly woman placed her hand on Brad's arm. "Oh, you're so kind," she said. They left the market together, and Brad walked her home, growing more impressed by her positive energy. Though she was alone, her joy and optimism left a deep impression on him. He thought to himself, everyone copes with pain in their own way. Maybe, he mused, the townsfolk would start to see that he wasn't as cold as they thought. He shrugged off the thought and went back to the market to finish his shopping. On the day of dinner, Brad was working with Paul at the repair shop. During a quiet moment, Brad hesitantly asked, "So, what are your plans for the holidays? Anything special?" Paul, surprised by the unexpected question, replied, "Yeah, I'm heading to the city tomorrow to see my son." "That's great. I didn't know you had a son," Brad said. Paul nodded, saying, "Yeah, he didn't want to live here. He moved to the city, got married, and now has a kid of his own. He's working as an accountant." Paul rarely shared personal details, but Brad felt a brief moment of happiness at this small connection. However, the moment didn't last long, and they both fell back into silence. As Brad was getting ready to leave, he rolled down his truck window and called out, "Hey boss." Paul turned around, looking at him. "I'm grilling tonight. I've got an elderly guest joining me. Want to come?" Brad asked. Paul was taken aback by the invitation but felt good seeing this positive change in Brad since the day before. Not wanting to decline, he replied, "Hang on, let me lock up the shop. I'll come with you and even help out." Brad was thrilled, quickly helped Paul tidy up the shop, and the two set off together. When they arrived at Brad's cabin, Paul was stunned. "This cabin looks like a palace now. You've done an amazing job," he said. Brad grinned, replying, "Thanks, I've got good taste." He added, "But the house is freezing, let me get the fireplace going." While Brad tended to the fire, Paul started preparing the grill. Before long, the two of them were sipping coffee from their thermoses, enjoying the snowy mountain view and the scent of pine trees as they grilled. Brad had already set the table, complete with salads and other sides. Glancing at the time, he said, "Oh, I need to pick up my guest. Make yourself at home," and grabbed his keys before heading out. Paul went inside to wait, but barely a few minutes had passed when he heard a car approaching. Brad couldn't be back this quickly, he thought, heading to the door. To his surprise, he saw Sarah walking toward the cabin, dressed in a red coat. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" Paul asked, bewildered. "Paul, what are you doing here?" Sarah responded with a laugh. "My mom mentioned she'd be coming here for dinner. She was so upset when she found out I couldn't come. I managed to finish my work early and thought I'd surprise her here. But instead I found you," she said, laughing. Paul invited her inside. "Well, welcome, unexpected guest. Brad works with me and invited me too. Come on in and warm up," he said. As the two chatted like old friends, the doorbell rang. When Paul opened the door, Brad's elderly guest entered cheerfully, holding a large container. "I brought a delicious potato salad for you," she announced. But then, noticing Sarah, she exclaimed, "Oh my goodness, Sarah," and threw her arms around her daughter. Brad watched this reunion in astonishment, quickly piecing together what was happening. He introduced himself to Sarah, and in that moment, an indescribable connection formed between them. Both were instantly drawn to each other. The rest of the dinner was filled with laughter and warm conversations, but the subtle chemistry between Brad and Sarah did not go unnoticed. Whenever their eyes met, they would stumble over their words, look away nervously, and then exchange shy smiles. Paul and Sarah's mother quietly observed this budding connection without interfering. After dinner, Brad and Sarah found themselves sitting by the fireplace, engrossed in conversation. Time slipped by unnoticed as they laughed and shared stories. Sarah's laughter was unlike anything Brad had ever heard before, and Brad's every word seemed to captivate Sarah further. That night wasn't just a dinner for Brad, it was the start of a new chapter in his life. After dinner, everyone started to feel sleepy and it was time to leave. As Brad walked his guests to the door, each of them warmly thanked him. Sarah, holding her mother's hand, turned to Brad. "Thank you for taking care of my mom and not letting her spend the evening alone," she said. Her eyes conveyed emotions she couldn't put into words. Brad, caught off guard by the glimmer in her gaze, struggled to find the right words in return. Sensing the sweet awkwardness in the air, the elderly woman chuckled softly. Paul, noticing the tension, quickly shifted the conversation. "Sarah, I'm heading to the city tomorrow. If you're planning to go back, we could drive together," he offered. Sarah paused for a moment, glanced at her mother and then at Brad and said, "I think I'll spend the rest of the week here. After all, it's New Year's week," she added with a smile, gently squeezing her mother's hand. When Sarah extended her hand to Brad, he shook it lightly and said, "It was nice meeting you." That night, everyone left with warm hearts and smiles on their faces. The dinner had been an evening of connection, cherished memories, and newfound hope for new beginnings. Sarah and Brad spent the entire week getting to know each other and growing closer. Brad found a joy he hadn't felt in years while talking to and spending time with Sarah. Sarah in turn felt surprisingly at ease around Brad, and with each passing day she became more aware of the harmony between them. Both were delighted by the unexpected bond that had formed. When New Year's Eve arrived, Brad and Sarah sat by the fireplace, gazing out at the snowy mountain landscape. As the clock struck midnight, Brad gathered his courage. His heart raced, but he no longer wanted to keep his feelings bottled up. He slowly turned to Sarah and gently kissed her. Sarah smiled and kissed him back. In that moment, they both knew they were stepping into a brand new chapter of their lives. That night, a spark of love ignited in the hearts of two people who had been searching for connection. Life reminded them once again that pain could only be overcome by leaving it behind and looking forward with hope. Together they welcomed 2025, holding on to hope and the promise of a new love. If Brad and Sarah's new beginning touched your heart, make sure to subscribe to our channel and stay tuned for more inspiring stories. Thank you and see you in the next one.